What if I told you that a single, totally unremarkable lake in Massachusetts holds the literal 1700s version of a secure blockchain?
Right.
Plus, a baby traded for the love of a lifetime, an international industrial smuggling ring, and, get this, the actual origins of Buffalo Bill.
It sounds made up, honestly.
It really does.
Yeah.
But I want you to picture something for a second. You are standing at the edge of a lake on a perfectly still morning. The mist is sitting really low, just kind of hugging the tree line, perfectly mirrored in the water.
Yeah.
And as you stand there looking out, you get this profound sense that the place is ancient. Not old like a vintage farmhouse, but an oldness that has everything to do with deep, relentless time.
It's the kind of stillness that you can actually feel in your bones.
Exactly. And that feeling isn't just your imagination playing tricks on you. Today, our mission is to take you to that exact spot. We are doing a deep dive into how a seemingly quiet patch of water in central Massachusetts Lake Maspenock serves as a literal microcosm for the entire history of North America.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And our guide for this journey is Dave Cormier's newly published 2026 book, The Complete History of Lake Maspenock.
And it is such a revealing text because, to really understand the human drama of this land, the triumphs, the tragedies, the constant displacement, you first have to understand the literal physical foundation it was built upon.
Right.
You just can't separate the history of the people from the geology of the ground beneath their feet.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before there was a lake, there was ice. We're talking about the Laurentide ice sheet going back some 20,000 years.
Oh, yeah. Massive.
The specific detail from the text that absolutely blew my mind is that the ice right here over central Massachusetts was over a mile thick.
A mile of solid ice.
A mile. I mean, I was trying to visualize that. That is 5 times taller than the tallest building in Boston today.
It's almost unfathomable when you really try to picture it. The sheer weight of a mile of solid ice is so immense that it literally depressed the Earth's crust. Yeah, and as this massive sheet moved, it scraped across the landscape like coarse sandpaper, dragging boulders, carving valleys, completely rewriting the topography.
Right.
But the real magic, geographically speaking, happens about 14,000 years ago when the climate starts to warm. And that glacier begins a very slow retreat northward.
Right, but it doesn't just, melt evenly like an ice cube on a sidewalk, does it?
No, not at all. As it retreats, the leading edge fractures, so it leaves behind these massive stranded blocks of ice, some of them the size of whole city blocks.
Okay.
And over time, glacial rivers wash immense amounts of sand and gravel right over these chunks. The ice gets buried underground, and because it's covered in earth, it stays insulated. It can literally sit down there for centuries without melting.
Wait, so it's just a giant hidden ice cube under the dirt?
Basically, yeah.
I kind of think of what happens next as a slow-motion pothole.
Ooh, I like that.
Because when that buried, insulated chunk of glacial ice finally does melt, the volume just disappears and the ground above it just caves in. It collapses to form a massive crater, which geologists call a kettle hole.
That is a brilliant visual. The slow-motion pothole is exactly what it is. But here's the crucial catch a kettle hole alone doesn't necessarily make a permanent lake.
Why not?
Well, in most places, the water from the melted ice would eventually just seep into the ground and drain away.
Oh, right.
This is where the bedrock of this specific Massachusetts location becomes the hero of the story. Beneath this area sits some of the oldest material we will ever walk on, Milford pink granite.
Which is incredibly tough stuff.
Completely indestructible. It's so tough that in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was quarried and shipped across the country to build famous monuments and train stations.
Yeah, they used it for everything.
Right. But its most important geological quality isn't just its strength, it's the fact that it is essentially waterproof.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, granite has an incredibly dense interlocking crystal structure. It does not soak up water like limestone or soil does. So when that buried glacial ice melted and the ground collapsed, the water had absolutely nowhere to drain.
It just sat there.
Exactly. It just pooled in the kettle hole, perfectly trapped by this impenetrable granite basin.
I mean, just imagine standing in your own hometown right now, picturing a mile of ice above your head, and then realizing how drastically the planet's landscape shifts and collapses just to form a serene body of water.
Yeah.
And because this newly formed freshwater oasis sat in a landscape that was still largely barren, almost like a tundra, it naturally acted as a beacon. It drew the very first humans to its shores about 12,000 years ago.
And over thousands of years, those early nomadic hunters evolved into the complex indigenous communities we now know as the Nipmuc. The name itself literally translates to freshwater people. Yeah. Though, as the text carefully points out, they didn't really use that broad monolithic label themselves until outsiders arrived. They actually operated as a fluid, highly adaptable network of families and villages that were deeply, intrinsically tied to the local riverways and lakes.
Their connection to the lake was incredibly deep.
Yeah.
But one of the most surprising historical details from the book, and something that completely flips the script on how this era is usually taught, is the role of Nipmuc women.
Yes.
They were really the primary architects of this society. We often hear these simplified male-centric histories of hunting and war, but Nipmuc women were the ones engineering daily survival.
Absolutely. The men focused on hunting, diplomacy, and their duties as warriors, but the relentless industry of the women was the actual backbone of the civilization.
Right.
They managed the agriculture, figuring out the precise timing of the seasons to cultivate corn, beans, and squash. They were master potters, rolling clay into long, snake-like coils to build vessels up layer by layer.
And the signatures?
Yes. They would press their own unique personal signature patterns into the drying clay before firing them.
I love that detail so much. A personal signature on a clay pot from hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
And they were also the literal home builders, right?
Yes. They built the weetus, the dome-shaped seasonal homes. And this wasn't simple labor, it was structural engineering. They had to harvest the right saplings, bend them into precise arches, and weave the protective outer mats.
Wow.
And when the seasons changed and it was time to move to the winter hunting grounds or the summer fishing camps, the women were the ones who dismantled the homes, packed up the heavy mats, and physically carried them to the next location.
Which brings me to a huge myth I really want to push back on here.
Go for it.
We have this deeply ingrained cultural narrative of the untamed wilderness. This idea that European colonists arrived to a wild, overgrown, untouched virgin continent.
Right.
But the book clearly shows that when early settlers arrived here around Lake Maspenock, they found a highly curated landscape. They found open meadows ready for mowing, cleared understories in the forests, and landscapes that looked almost like English parks.
Because the environment wasn't untouched at all. The Nipmuc were utilizing highly sophisticated controlled burns.
Yep.
They understood ecology. By periodically setting low-intensity fires in the underbrush, they cleared out the deadwood. This had multiple cascading benefits. It returned crucial nutrients to the soil in the form of ash. It made travel through the woods infinitely easier, and it actively promoted the growth of specific plants like berries.
Which brought the animals.
Exactly. It drew the deer and turkey herds they hunted right to them. They were actively managing the forest for thousands of years.
And their presence wasn't just in the vegetation, was it? It was literally etched into stone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the stone structures they left behind in the woods around the lake. Just a few miles from Maspenock is the Upton chamber. It is a massive, dry-laid stone structure. We're talking about a 14-foot entrance tunnel leading into a perfectly constructed 12-foot stone dome, all topped by a huge, heavy capstone.
That's incredible. Modern archaeological dating puts its construction somewhere between 1350 and 1625 AD, right?
That's right.
What was it actually used for?
Yeah.
Because a 12-foot stone dome is a massive undertaking.
There is still debate. Some archaeological theories suggest it was used as an astronomical observatory to track solstices for agricultural timing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but others, backed by historical letters from early colonists like Roger Williams, indicate it was a specialized sweat lodge used for spiritual and physical purification.
And alongside the chamber, the woods around the lake are just full of these mysterious stone cairns, these carefully stacked piles of rocks. What I found so brilliant and honestly heartbreaking is how the book describes the Nipmuc preserving their culture right under the noses of the Puritans. The Puritan settlers were fiercely intolerant. I mean, they viewed literally anything outside their strict religious dogma as the work of the devil.
Right. Any indigenous spiritual practice was immediately targeted for destruction.
So when the Puritans would find these sacred stone piles in the woods and angrily demand to know what they were for, the Nipmuc would just shrug, play innocent, and say, I don't know, my father always told me to do this.
It was a brilliant strategy of obfuscation.
Yeah.
By reducing a deeply sacred practice to just a meaningless, quaint family habit, They successfully de-escalated the Puritan threat. It was passive resistance. But as we know, passive resistance is only effective for so long.
Right.
Eventually, the colonial pressure shifted from merely claiming the land to demanding total ideological submission. And that's where we see the tragic experiment of the praying towns.
So explain the praying towns, because this was a very deliberate policy.
It was. In the mid-1600s, Puritan missionaries, most notably John Eliot, set up these frontier villages like Magungaquag, which was established right near Lake Maspenock. The explicit goal was aggressive assimilation. Indigenous people were pressured to move into these towns, renounce all their traditional ceremonies, stop speaking the Nipmuc language, cut their hair, and adopt English clothing and English laws.
And John Eliot usually gets all the historical credit for printing the 1660 Algonquin Bible to aid this conversion.
He does.
But the text points out something incredible. The immense, grueling physical labor of actually setting the type for that Bible was largely done by Nipmuc men.
Right.
A man named James Printer literally placed the thousands of individual metal letters backward into the press to print a book designed to erase his own culture.
It is a stark image. But, you know, the superficial veneer of English life in these praying towns hid a massive amount of internal resistance.
Yeah.
The archaeology from Magungaquag proves it.
Oh, absolutely.
When scholars finally located the remains of the village's fair house, the central meeting house on Magunko Hill, the artifacts they pulled out of the dirt told a completely different story than what the missionaries reported.
The findings there are incredible. I was reading this section, and I can only describe it as the Nipmuc hacking colonial tech to run native software.
I love that. The archaeologists formally call it cultural inversion.
What does that actually look like in the dirt, though?
Well, they found these standard English red paste ceramic pots, the exact kind the Puritans distributed. But these pots had heavy charring all over the outside.
Okay.
Now, the English didn't cook like that. They hung their pots over the fire or placed them on trivets. But the Nipmuc put these English pots directly into the embers, maintaining their traditional native food preparation methods.
Oh, smart.
Yeah. They were using the colonial shell, but keeping the core of their culture alive.
And they didn't stop at the cooking. They found 16 quartz crystals scattered at the site, including 3 that were deliberately hidden in the deepest foundation corners of that fair house.
Right. Quartz was deeply sacred in Nipmuc spirituality. By burying it in the foundation of the Puritan meeting house, they were physically maintaining their spiritual markers in a world that was entirely under siege.
And that siege, inevitably, tragically, boiled over into King Philip's War in 1675.
It did. And it is crucial we look at this conflict objectively because it is one of the most brutal chapters in the continent's history. And the devastation was absolute on both sides.
Yeah.
The triggers for the war weren't simple. They were incredibly complex and had been building for decades. You had intense, fraudulent land disputes. You had English livestock like pigs and cows roaming free and completely destroying unfenced native cornfields and clam beds.
Recipe for disaster.
Completely. And then you had the controversial execution of native leaders by colonial courts, which completely undermined indigenous sovereignty.
The tension just snapped.
It did. The war ignited with devastating raids, including a major Nipmuc strike on the nearby settlement of Mendon, where warriors burned houses and killed several settlers.
Right.
And the English countermeasures were equally severe, organizing brutal militias and committing massacres at undefended native fishing camps.
If we look at the statistics from the book, it's just horrifying.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the demographic toll is staggering to comprehend. For the English colonists, 5 to 10% of their entire adult male population was killed.
Wow.
It devastated their frontier economy and completely destroyed 12 towns. But for the Nipmuc, the war was an absolute apocalypse. Their total population was essentially halved, dropping to under 500 people.
That's just unimaginable.
It is. This happened through direct combat, widespread disease, deliberate starvation as their crops were burned, and horrific internment policies.
Right. Deer Island.
Yes. Hundreds of natives, including those from the praying towns who hadn't even fought, were forced onto the freezing, barren shores of Deer Island in Boston Harbor during winter. Many of the survivors of the war were ultimately sold into slavery in the West Indies.
And in the ashes of that war, the native survivors who remained were entirely displaced. And the land they had curated for centuries, this carefully managed ecosystem around the lake, suddenly just became a financial commodity on a ledger. In 1715, several of the displaced Nipmuc from the Magungaquag village actually sent a formal letter to the colonial government trying to stop the sale of their ancestral home. They wrote, "We are just poor Indians and are not willing to sell our land."
It is a desperate plea for basic recognition, and it was entirely ignored.
Complete.
The land was sold for £800 to Hawkins trustees, a group associated with Harvard College. Their goal was simply to lease the land out to generate revenue to fund education.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, legally speaking. This specific land transfer gives us the literal origin of the word indenture. I had no idea about this.
Oh, it's a fascinating mechanical detail of historical law.
Yeah.
When they made these lease contracts, they obviously didn't have carbon copy paper, so the clerks would take a single large piece of animal parchment. They would write the exact same contract twice, once on the top half, once on the bottom.
And then, instead of cutting it straight across with scissors, they would cut a jagged, random, tooth-like wave across the middle to separate the two copies.
Right, the teeth of the cut. Indent literally meaning teeth.
Wait, so if there was ever a legal dispute over the terms of the lease decades later, the only way to mathematically prove your contract was the genuine original was to physically bring your half to the courthouse and match your jagged edge perfectly to the other party's jagged edge, like a puzzle piece.
Exactly. Because it was cut by hand, the specific wave could never be forged or replicated.
That is basically a 1700s version of a secure blockchain. It's a physical cryptographic key.
That is the perfect analogy. And the people who were signing those physical indentures for the Maspenock land were brought in by a merchant named James Gordon.
Okay.
They were an influx of poor Scotch-Irish immigrants. Because they had generational experience as tenant farmers back in Ireland, they were willing to take on these brutal wilderness leases. They moved into the dense woods, manually pulled the massive tree stumps, cleared the glacial stones by hand, and carved out working farms.
And they were deeply religious, helping to found the local Congregational Church in 1724. But just 7 years later, in 1731, they were formally excommunicated and completely shunned by that exact same church. Why?
It comes down to deep theological and structural friction. The Scotch-Irish were Presbyterian, while the English settlers were strict Congregationalists.
Okay, what's the difference there?
Well, the Congregationalists believed in total local control of the church, and they legally required everyone in town to pay taxes to support it. The Presbyterians believed in a regional synod governance and pushed back against this local taxation.
Oh, I see.
In a modern city, a church dispute is minor. But in a completely isolated frontier town in 1731, being excommunicated meant you were cut off socially and economically. Your neighbors wouldn't trade with you, help you raise a barn, or come to your aid. It was a slow death sentence.
So they literally had to flee. This image from the book is seared into my brain. In 1734, these excommunicated families realize they can't survive the isolation.
Right.
They pack up whatever they can carry, load up their animals in the dead of winter, and walk 90 miles west through completely uncharted, rugged wilderness to found the town of Blandford.
It's astonishing.
They survived the trek mostly by drinking milk straight from their cows. And when they finally arrived at the new site, they were hit by a massive 3-day blizzard. They survived only by huddling together under piles of pine and hemlock boughs. The human resilience is just off the charts.
It truly is. And the moment those Scotch-Irish families fled west, their abandoned, freshly cleared Maspenock farmsteads didn't stay empty for long.
No.
They were quickly taken over by a new wave of Yankee farmers. Men like Seth Nelson, whose 1750s farmstead, the intricate stone walls, the deep foundations, the hand-dug wells, is amazingly still intact today at the end of Old Town Road.
Which actually brings us to a really interesting debate about the translation of the lake's name itself. In the 19th century, a prominent local historian named Adin Ballou translated Maspenock from the original Nipmuc language to mean choice fishing place. But the book notes that modern linguistic analysis completely disagrees.
Yeah, modern scholars break down the prefixes and suffixes of the word and say it actually means place at the base of the Great Hill.
Though, to be fair to Adin Ballou, the author humorously points out that the lake remains an incredibly choice fishing place to this very day, so both interpretations feel remarkably fitting.
Very true.
And speaking of Adin Ballou, it's his ancestor, Josiah Ball, who settled in this specific North Purchase area in 1732. And the book outlines his life to give us one of the most deeply moving, complex stories in the entire text.
Yes, the story of Josiah and Duno. Josiah and his wife Rachel lost an infant child shortly after moving to their frontier farm. Sometime later, Josiah was in Boston on business, and through a series of events was given a 4-week-old enslaved black baby.
Oh.
The boy's legal name was Andrew Dooner, but the family always called him Duno.
Wait, how does a man in the 1700s transport a 4-week-old infant from Boston all the way to central Massachusetts on horseback?
With incredible care. Josiah literally fashioned a primitive nursing bottle and carried this newborn baby in his arms while riding a horse for dozens of miles.
That's wild.
He fed him along the rugged dirt roads, arrived at his farmhouse at midnight, walked inside, and quietly placed the sleeping infant in bed next to his grieving wife.
Who I imagine woke up completely terrified at the sudden appearance of a baby in her bed.
She definitely woke up screaming. But once the initial shock wore off, the way the Ball family raised Duno becomes this fascinating, deeply layered study in the moral complexities of the colonial era.
Yeah.
Josiah treated Duno with immense parental kindness, which was an anomaly. Duno ate meals at the family table, he was taught to read and write, and he was treated essentially as a beloved son.
But the grim reality is, under the law, he was still enslaved. He was property.
Precisely. It is the great paradox of history. You have this deep, genuine human compassion existing directly within the brutal, dehumanizing legal framework of colonial slavery.
Right.
But the story takes an incredible turn. When Duno turned 21, Josiah summoned him and formally declared him a free man, citing his own deeply held belief in Christian equality.
And Duno's reaction surprised me. He initially refused the freedom. He told Josiah he wanted to stay on the farm.
He did, but Josiah insisted that a man must be free. To ensure Duno had a real chance at life, Josiah gave him a fine white horse, which was an incredibly valuable asset at the time.
It's huge.
Duno takes the horse, rides over to the neighboring town of Marlborough, meets an enslaved woman named Rose, and literally trades his prized white horse to her owner to buy her freedom.
That is just incredible. He trades his only asset for love.
And it gets better. They get married and they return to Maspenock. Josiah actually deeds them 12 acres of his own farmstead so they can build their own house.
Oh.
Yeah. They raise their children there, living in freedom into old age. It's a beautiful, complex story of humanity and love actively pushing through the legal constraints of its time.
And just down the dirt road from the Ball farm, on what is now Camp Street, was another pioneer named Joseph Cody. He settled by the lake in 1760. And the book describes him as this brilliant master carpenter. He was the kind of artisan who could frame a massive, complex building entirely by eye. No measuring tools, just perfectly cutting joints and mortises that fit together like a puzzle.
He was a foundational member of the community. But tragically, his life ended in complete ruin. He died totally destitute in 1787 at the age of 51.
How does a master carpenter with that much skill end up completely bankrupt?
It was the frontier credit system. In an era before established banks, neighbors relied on a complex web of mutual credit. You needed a guarantor to co-sign any debt.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. Joseph Cody was generous, perhaps too generous, and acted as a financial guarantor for several friends and relatives. When the post-revolutionary economy crashed, those friends defaulted.
Well, he was on the hook.
Exactly. Because there was no bankruptcy protection, the creditors legally came after Cody. They took his tools, his property, his livelihood. The sheer stress of that total financial ruin literally caused his health to collapse, killing him.
That is devastating. But the Cody bloodline didn't stop in that ruined Massachusetts farmhouse, did it?
Not at all. Joseph Cody had a son named Philip who moved away. And Philip's grandson, Joseph Cody's great-grandson, went completely west and became none other than the legendary frontiersman and international showman William Buffalo Bill Cody.
Wait, Buffalo Bill.
Yeah.
As in the Wild West icon, his roots trace directly back to a bankrupt carpenter at Lake Maspenock.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? I want you, the listener, to really think about this. The soil around this one specific lake is a stacked timeline.
It really is.
You have a mile-thick glacier that crushed the earth. Indigenous weedus and sacred quartz crystals hidden in foundations, displaced Scotch-Irish refugees surviving blizzards, a freed man riding a white horse to trade for the love of his life, and the direct ancestors of Buffalo Bill. And it is all layered right on top of each other in the exact same dirt.
That's the beauty of looking closely at local history. Lake Maspenock isn't just a body of water. It is a living, breathing record of survival.
Yeah.
It's a testament to displacement and relentless innovation. From the Nipmuc women masterfully engineering their homes and firing unique pottery, to the Scotch-Irish clinging to life under pine boughs, to Duno securing his family's future. The history isn't gone, it's just sitting quietly under the surface.
And that is the ultimate takeaway here. Wherever you're listening to this right now, whether you are walking down a city street or looking out your kitchen window, the ground beneath your feet has a similarly dense, invisible tapestry. The triumphs, the quiet tragedies, the daily grind of survival, it's all there beneath the pavement and the grass.
And this raises an important question. One last detail from the text to chew on before we go.
Yeah.
In 1827, on the river feeding this very lake, a man named Ebenezer Hunt built a massive woolen factory. But to run it and get ahead of the competition, he brought over an Englishman named John Schofield, a man who had literally smuggled highly classified secret industrial methods out of Great Britain.
Wow.
So we look at these quiet natural landscapes like lakes, and we see only peace. But you have to wonder how many tranquil waters in our own backyards were actually the hidden launch pads for stolen industrial secrets that built the modern world.
It makes you look at every quiet pond a little differently, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Next time you find yourself standing at the edge of a mist-covered lake, sensing that ancient stillness, remember the ice is gone, but the stories are still echoing across the water. Until next time.